December 1942. Washington, D.C. The Pentagon. Admiral King spread his maps of the Pacific on the conference table and made an argument that the Joint Chiefs had been hearing variations of for 6 months, and that was finally going to produce the strategic decision that would determine the course of the Pacific War for the next 2 years. The argument was about Rabaul. Rabaul was a harbour on the northeastern tip of the island of New Britain, in the southwestern Pacific, and it was the most important Japanese military base in the Pacific south of Truk. The Japanese had seized it from the Australians in January 1942 and had spent the subsequent months transforming it into the central hub of Japanese military power in the region, building 5 airfields, establishing a harbour that could shelter and supply a major fleet, constructing fortifications that were by any assessment among the strongest in the Pacific, and garrisoning it with approximately 100,000 soldiers. Rabaul's strategic importance was absolute. It was the base from which Japanese air power had operated against the Guadalcanal campaign. It was the staging point from which Japanese naval forces had sortied against Allied supply lines. It was the administrative center for Japanese control of New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Bismarck Archipelago. If the Allies were going to advance toward Japan, they had to deal with Rabaul. The question was how. The conventional answer, the answer that conventional military logic produced when applied to a fortified enemy base that controlled the surrounding region, was to attack it. Build up enough force, develop enough air superiority over the approaches, and assault the island with sufficient ground troops to overwhelm the garrison. It was what American military planning had been built around since the first days of the Pacific War. King had a different idea. The idea was rooted in a principle that Sun Tzu had articulated centuries earlier and that naval strategists had been rediscovering ever since. The most effective way to defeat an enemy force is not always to attack it. Sometimes the most effective way is to make its position irrelevant by controlling the strategic environment around it. Rabaul's garrison of 100,000 soldiers could only be a threat if it could be supplied, reinforced, and used as a base for offensive operations. Cut those supply lines. Neutralize the airfields through repeated air attack. Capture the smaller bases around Rabaul rather than Rabaul itself. Make the base strategically irrelevant while avoiding the frontal assault that would cost tens of thousands of American lives. Bypass Rabaul. The idea was not immediately accepted by everyone in the Allied command. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the Southwest Pacific area, wanted to take Rabaul. His campaign plan, which he had been developing since the first days of his command, called for a direct advance along the northern coast of New Guinea and then the seizure of Rabaul as the central objective of the Southwest Pacific campaign. MacArthur's vision was dramatic and direct, and it would cost a great many American and Australian lives. The Joint Chiefs, influenced by King and by the growing understanding of what had been learned at Tarawa and Peleliu about the cost of assaulting heavily fortified positions, chose the bypass strategy. Operation Cartwheel was the result. Cartwheel was a coordinated campaign that MacArthur and Admiral Halsey would conduct simultaneously, with MacArthur advancing along the New Guinea coast and Halsey advancing through the Solomon Islands. Both drives aimed not at Rabaul itself but at the ring of smaller bases that surrounded and supported it. Each step of the advance would bring the Allied air forces closer to Rabaul's airfields, making those airfields increasingly untenable under the weight of air attack. Each captured base would be used to advance the next step, leapfrogging along the coasts and island chains in the pattern that became known as island hopping. The genius of Cartwheel, and it was genuine operational genius of the kind that distinguishes great strategic minds from merely competent ones, was the understanding that what made Rabaul dangerous was not its garrison of 100,000 soldiers but its function as a hub of Japanese strategic power in the region. Destroy the function and the garrison became irrelevant. The 100,000 soldiers who had been a strategic asset became a strategic liability, consuming resources that Japan needed elsewhere while contributing nothing to its war effort. The campaign that implemented Cartwheel began in mid-1943 with operations in both theaters and proceeded through the rest of 1943 and into early 1944 with a systematic thoroughness that reflected the strategic vision behind it. In the Solomon Islands, Halsey's forces advanced northward through the island chain in a series of operations that captured or bypassed the Japanese bases at Munda, Columbangra, Vella La Vella, Bougainville, and the Green Islands. Each operation brought Halsey's air forces closer to Rabaul while avoiding the massive casualties that assaulting the heavily defended island would have required. The air campaign that accompanied the ground advances was itself a strategic instrument of the first order. Beginning in October 1943, Allied air forces based at the newly captured fields began systematic attacks on Rabaul's 5 airfields and its harbour facilities. The Japanese air forces that had made Rabaul the hub of Pacific air power were forced into a battle of attrition that they could not sustain. The air battles over Rabaul in November and December 1943 were among the most intense of the Pacific War and produced a result that changed the strategic situation more fundamentally than any single ground engagement could have. The Japanese air groups that had been based at Rabaul, the units that had fought at Guadalcanal and Bougainville and that represented years of training and operational experience, were destroyed in a matter of weeks. Admiral Koga, who had replaced Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet after Yamamoto was killed in April 1943, made the decision to reinforce Rabaul's air power with aircraft and pilots from his carrier fleet. The carrier pilots who flew to Rabaul to defend the base against the Allied air offensive were the product of years of training, the best that Japanese naval aviation had produced since Midway had decimated the previous generation. They were destroyed in the air battles over Rabaul. When Koga withdrew the surviving carrier pilots in November 1943, he was admitting that Rabaul could not be defended against the Allied air offensive. The Japanese carrier fleet that had been the central instrument of Pacific naval power for 2 years had been effectively stripped of its experienced aircrew. When those carriers would eventually face the American fleet again, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, they would be flown by undertrained replacements whose inadequacy would produce the catastrophic loss ratio that American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The logical connection between the air battles over Rabaul in late 1943 and the disaster of the Philippine Sea in mid-1944 has not always been drawn as clearly as the evidence supports. What happened at Rabaul in November and December 1943 was not just a tactical success for Allied air power. It was the destruction of the Japanese carrier air arms experienced cadre, a loss that Japan could not replace and that determined the outcome of every subsequent carrier engagement of the Pacific War. In the New Guinea theater, MacArthur's forces were conducting the leapfrogging advance along the coast that would eventually bring them to the Philippines. The operations at Lae, Finschhafen, Seda, the Admiralty Islands, and Hollandia bypassed Japanese concentrations and isolated Japanese garrisons in the same pattern that Cartwheel prescribed, each advance supported by air power from the previous step, each step making the next step possible. The Admiralty Islands operation in late February and early March 1944 was the decisive step that completed the isolation of Rabaul. The capture of the Admiralties, specifically of the Manus Island harbour complex, gave the Allies a base that sat astride Rabaul's last supply lines and that could support the air operations that would make those supply lines completely untenable. General MacArthur flew to the Admiralties personally to observe the initial landing, a characteristic gesture that reflected both his personal courage and his understanding that the operation's success was critical to the strategic design of Cartwheel. His presence at the beachhead during the initial confused fighting, under fire, communicating confidence to troops who were uncertain about the situation, was noted by the soldiers who observed it with the respect that soldiers always give to generals who are willing to share the frontline experience. The fall of the Admiralties sealed Rabaul's fate. The harbour that Japanese supply ships had used to reach Rabaul was now covered by Allied air power based in the Admiralties. The supply ships that had been maintaining the garrison stopped coming. The 100,000 Japanese soldiers who had been the heart of Japanese power in the southwestern Pacific began the slow process of consuming the stockpiles they had accumulated before the isolation, a process that would last until the war ended. On March 20, 1944, Admiral Nimitz issued the directive that officially recognized what the strategic situation had already established. Rabaul would be neutralized rather than assaulted. Allied forces would continue to bypass it on the advance toward Japan. The 100,000 Japanese soldiers who had been the garrison of the most powerful base in the southern Pacific remained in their fortifications for the rest of the war, increasingly irrelevant, increasingly hungry, watching the Allied advance proceed past them toward the Philippines and eventually toward Japan itself. When the war ended in August 1945, the Rabaul garrison surrendered. They had never been defeated in battle. They had been made irrelevant by an American strategic vision that understood that defeating an enemy force did not require destroying it directly. The lives that were saved by the bypass strategy were not countable in any precise way because nobody could know what the assault on Rabaul would actually have cost. The estimates that military planners made at the time, and the retrospective assessments that historians have made since, suggest that a frontal assault on Rabaul would have cost between 50,000 and 100,000 American and Australian casualties. The bypass strategy saved those lives while achieving the same strategic result. Admiral Halsey, reflecting on the Cartwheel campaign after the war, described the bypass strategy in terms that captured its fundamental insight. "We didn't fight for Rabaul," Halsey said. "We fought around it. The Japanese who were in Rabaul were there because we let them be there. They were not a threat to us anymore. They were a problem for Japan, consuming resources that Japan needed to fight us elsewhere. The best thing we could have done to them was exactly what we did. Left them there. He was right. The 100,000 soldiers in Rabaul who had been Japan's primary strategic instrument in the Southwest Pacific were transformed, by the bypass strategy, into a burden on the Japanese war economy that the Japanese could not afford and could not abandon. The operational genius of Cartwheel was not the fighting, though the fighting that implemented it was intense and costly in its own right. The genius was the strategic vision that understood what needed to be accomplished and found a way to accomplish it at a cost that was proportional to the strategic result. General George Marshall, reviewing the Cartwheel campaign from Washington, described it as the most efficient use of military force he had observed in his career as a soldier. MacArthur, who had initially resisted the bypass strategy but had executed it brilliantly once the decision was made, received credit for the operational artistry with which Cartwheel was implemented. The credit was deserved. But the original insight, the understanding that Rabaul could be neutralized without being assaulted, that the 100,000 soldiers in its fortifications could be made irrelevant by controlling the strategic environment around them rather than fighting through them, belonged to the strategic minds that had looked at the conventional answer and found a better one. The soldiers who did not have to assault Rabaul never knew how close they came to having to do it. They fought other battles, in New Guinea and the Philippines and Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and many of them died in those battles. But they did not die storming the beaches of Rabaul, and the reason they did not was that American strategic thinking in 1943 produced a vision of how to win a campaign that was more sophisticated than attacking the strongest point in the enemy's defensive line. That is Cartwheel. That is what the bypass of Rabaul accomplished, and what it cost, and what it saved. It saved 100,000 lives, approximately, by understanding that the best way to defeat 100,000 enemies is sometimes to leave them where they are.